thrilled to welcome Alexandra Sunderland, Engineering Manager at Fellow. This session is entitled How to Successfully Onboard Engineers. Whether you're a manager, a lead, or developer eager to help out, you'll learn how to create your own exceptional onboarding process and hear about Alexandra's onboarding failures and eventual success. Alexandra, thanks so much for joining us. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining my talk today about onboarding engineers onto your team. I'm excited that I get to talk about this with you today because even with the world being what it is right now, people are still starting new jobs, and a lot of those people are starting them remotely when that wasn't necessarily what they or their teams were expecting. It's not always easy to translate an in-person onboarding process into a remote one, or even easy to create one from scratch. But onboarding is such an important part of bringing in a new team member. So I wanted to tell you today about how we built our process at Fellow and give you some tips on how you can create your own too. I'm Alexandra Sunderland, and I've been working as an engineer for almost the last decade. And right now I'm an engineering manager at Fellow, which is based in Ottawa in Canada. I've spent a lot of time putting together onboarding processes and helping engineers get set up on new teams throughout my career. I created the onboarding process at Fellow, and before that, I was at SurveyMonkey, where I was a coordinator for the internship program, where I built processes to onboard students and also help teams create their own onboarding processes too. I've been working in this hybrid remote setup for the last 4 years, and actually my first day of being full-time in the office was supposed to be a week after the whole city transitioned to work from home back in March. So kind of too bad, but I have all this experience from working remote and also in this hybrid situation, and now and also from working in person. So this has definitely helped me with setting up a lot of processes to be inclusive of different situations. Onboarding is crucial to a team's long-term success because it sets the stage for your team and demonstrates what the real values are. If you don't focus on actively showing things like clear communication and onboarding, which is very important, it's a lot less likely that after getting caught up to speed, everyone is going to magically start communicating really efficiently. So creating a good onboarding process really makes sure that people feel that they have psychological safety, and it goes a long way towards being able to quickly scale up a team where everyone can trust each other, everyone can be vulnerable, and everyone can feel okay asking for help and learning. I've always had a particular empathy for people starting a new job, and I think it's because of how absolutely lost I felt when I started my first programming job. When I was really young, I got super lucky and I got an internship over the summer before starting university at a local startup. And I pretty much only knew Visual Basic and some Java, so the stuff they teach you in school. And I had never heard of web programming. I didn't even know you could have web apps as a business because this was back when you download most of the software you wanted to use. So long story short, I spent weeks Googling things like what is an API, what is a webhook, what is a request, what is a server, and how do you log into server and all this stuff because I had no idea what I was doing. I did not know who to ask, and it felt like I was kind of assumed. It felt like it was assumed that I was supposed to have all the answers already. There was no onboarding process, so I felt kind of lost, and that experience really always stuck with me. It was the best learning experience I've ever had out of any of my summers. I learned a ton, but that's not scalable when you're trying to build a whole team out. Since then, I've helped onboard a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and I've also screwed up in the process a ton. So the first time I onboarded someone, I walked them through the entire code base, which was thousands and thousands of lines of code. And I explained every single little bit of code to them without providing any context on what the application did, who was using it, why it was built, and all this stuff. And it was awful because they had no idea how to go about answering their own questions. And there was no way for them to remember everything that I said. So I also taught a class for a specific technology at my last job for all new incoming engineers, but only a handful of them ever needed to use it. And it ended up being a very boring waste of time for everyone. I've also done things like assumed people know way more about the organization than they do. So I've accidentally had someone believe for a whole week that I was their manager when I was not their manager. So I've made a lot of mistakes, but that also means that I've learned a ton and adapted from those. And every single time I make a mistake, the process gets a lot better. Now, it's important to go into onboarding assuming that the person you've hired has the skills and the abilities to perform the job they were hired to do, but doesn't yet have any of the context necessary. So eventually, after making a lot more mistakes with a lot more people, I narrowed down a framework for onboarding people that we now use at Fellow, and about half the company has been through. So we've shaped the process together over time as we've collected feedback, and this framework is what I would like to share with you today so that you can also create your own onboarding process to help get engineers on your team up to speed quickly and effectively. Before we get started, it's important to frame everything you do and every process that you set up through the eyes of the new hire. So think back to when you first started and all the questions that you had and the difficulties you encountered. And remember that when they start, they likely won't know anyone or any of the internal process or traditions and will probably be feeling a little bit out of place when they try to get up to speed. It's important to focus this whole process building around empathy towards people. And right now, it's especially important to have an even deeper sense of empathy. Whether or not they were hired to work remotely, the current situation is not normal remote work. If they were hired expecting to come into an office, they might not have a proper office space set up at home, or they might not have fast internet, or they might be looking after kids, or they might just not overall have the ideal work from home setup. Whatever their situation, it's important to be patient and understanding and to reassure them that you're there for them and that you also understand that this won't be a totally normal work environment for a while. Step 1, focus on relationships. The most important part of onboarding is setting up the right relationships early on. By making those connections early, it'll be a lot easier for the person to start talking with others and ask any questions that they need to get up to speed faster. It can be kind of awkward coming in somewhere and not knowing who's in charge of what or who you're supposed to ask certain things from, or like not even knowing whether people even realize that you exist. Some of the most important interactions that you can start setting up are your one-on-ones. Make sure that you set up your first one-on-one with your new direct report early on and keep it going on a regular cycle so that they know they have a time and a space to talk to you about their career goals, their ideas, their concerns, and whatever they have to say. This is a great time for you to get a good pulse check on how they're doing and talk about things that they might not want to bring up in team meetings. Introducing them to team members is important, but also sometimes forgotten. So make sure that your team knows in advance that someone is joining and let them know to welcome them when they're there. You'll also probably want to introduce them to people in other teams they'll be working with, like designers or product or sales, because knowing each other early on can make collaboration easier later. And very importantly, set them up with a buddy. It will be easier for them to ask questions if they know they have a dedicated person to go to who is expecting to be bombarded with a lot of questions for the first little while. When you're working remotely, this relationship step is especially important and has to be done in a very deliberate way since the chance of hallway talk is a bit lower and kind of difficult for people who aren't really used to doing that remotely. I like to use a Slack message or an email to have the new hire introduce themselves to the company. And Slack is really great because if they post a message in a general channel for everyone to see, then the whole company can start adding happy emojis and replying in threads and getting to know people right away. And that really makes it feel more inclusive. Setting them up with a buddy here is extremely important because when you can't visibly see whether or not someone is getting annoyed with your questions, you're going to be less likely to ask them. And this is a point in time where it is critical to ask as many questions as possible. If they're set up with a dedicated question answerer, they're not going to feel as bad about it. Instead of sending emails to intro them to the people they'll be working with, set up individual video calls so they can get a feel for how the person communicates. Getting an indication for things like sarcasm level in speech can be really important information and avoid some pretty bad mix-ups later on. Don't schedule them all back to back though, because video call fatigue is very real. And if your new hire is an introvert, that would be an extremely exhausting step of an already very stressful time for them. Step 2, write knowledge down. There is so much knowledge that your team has, which is just known stuff that any outsider would not be able to figure out for themselves without asking. Every single team has this, and it creates a bottleneck. You should figure out what that information is and write it down. So if there's ever an issue that comes up in the team and someone says, oh yeah, that happened to me last week and I did this to solve it, you should write it down. Or if there's an announcement at a team meeting about a new way of doing things or a new linter to install or something like that, you should write that down. And this doesn't have to look like the type of documentation you'd expect from a third-party library or API or something, but it should still cover the things that are very specific to your teams. And that's not just going to help out the new hires, it'll end up paying off for the people within the team too. I've gone back to our own dev docs so many times just because I keep forgetting how to run specific tests. And this should be a collaborative effort from everyone on the team and should be a living document that's changing almost every day. You can set up this knowledge base in an online collaboration tool. So we host our own internal docs site built on the Read the Docs Sphinx theme because it's very familiar to us as Python developers. But I've also seen GitLab does this by hosting docs on their own GitLab platform, which is kind of cool. And I suggest trying that out. Step 3, create a frequently asked questions. So similar to your code bases documentation, you should create a team and company frequently asked questions document. There are so many not in code things that are just known within the team, like how to properly create a pull request or how to request time off or what the Jira process is or how to hand off tickets to QA, where the Wi-Fi info is stored, meeting etiquette, and just anything kind of like that. There's a ton, and it can all be figured out by someone by just living within the team for a while, but it'll also reduce a lot of stress by having answers to some of those questions up front. And this is also something that everyone on the team can contribute to and should be something that new hires add questions to when they're discovering that they wish they knew something. Both for this and the code-based documentation, they're very helpful for people working remotely because they won't have that in-person context available. For example, we had a Friday meeting booked on our calendar, which wasn't actually a meeting, and people kept getting confused about it, but they were in person in the office. And they got to see that we weren't all standing up to go to this meeting and eventually figured out for themselves. That context is not there when remote, and so it is very good to write these kinds of things down. Step 4, set goals and milestones. One of the biggest stress-inducing parts of joining a new team is not knowing what you're expected to accomplish and by when. So it's pretty common to see people going overboard trying to do as much as they possibly can in the shortest amount of time, or working overtime in the first few months while pretending that they aren't, just to make it seem like they have it all together. I've definitely done this. It can really feel like you're supposed to be as good as the existing team members when you join, and that's impossible because you aren't used to the code base and you don't have all this knowledge that they've acquired over potentially years. So to avoid that, you should set out a realistic timeline for different goals for them to accomplish. For example, break down the dev setup process into small chunks, like getting localhost running, get 30 third-party integrations running, or whatever it is, and that might span a day. And then set out a goal for completing a particular ticket or creating a pull request, and whatever little units of work you can do in 1 week on your team. These should be easily doable so that the new hire feels like they're on track when they get to check everything off. And then set up goals for them to track their progress throughout the next 3 months. They should have a clear understanding of what knowledge they're expected to have and what pace they should be working at by that point. So by defining exactly what you're looking for, they're not going to burn themselves out and will know how to plan out their work to meet the goals. It gives them something to work towards, and if they surpass expectations, then they'll get a chance to be proud, and getting that boosts their productivity in return too. When you're remote, you should celebrate the goals and milestones that they achieve on a team Slack channel. It's not really easy for them to swivel around in their chair and announce to their desk neighbor that they've created their first pull request, so look out for those moments and call them out so that the team can celebrate with them. Even when I was in the office in person, one of the ways that I felt extremely welcome to the team was when my manager commented on my first pull request saying that I did a great job and congratulations. It made me very happy. Step 5, set up their physical space. This might seem obvious, but it's actually sometimes forgotten. So make sure that you have a computer and any other required hardware for people well in advance of their start date. I've seen a lot of people scramble to clear off the storage desk so that they have somewhere to sit on their first day. And when people are working remotely, you'll have to take a step further and figure out how to get the hardware right to the person's home. So people who are working from home right now might not have been expecting to be working that way, and their homes might not have a setup with a proper office space or any of the equipment. So you should figure out whether your company can allocate a budget to outfit their home office or if there's any equipment that can be loaned to them. Having things like a desk, a chair, and a monitor can make a big difference compared to sitting on the couch looking at a laptop for a few weeks or months. I did this for a few months in university and I had to go to physio just to fix my back because I was straining it looking down at my laptop so much. It's not a good idea. It's also a good idea to make sure that they have fast unlimited internet because otherwise doing things like having video calls or installing software or uploading a new version of the app might be kind of worrisome for them. Step 6, ask for feedback. Asking for feedback is something that does not come naturally, especially if it's about you or something you've made and you're proud of. But it's a really important step in this process because if you don't do it, you're going to be missing out on key insights about things that aren't working. I have a feedback survey that I send to every new engineer after their first week on the team, which I send within Fellow's feedback request tool. I ask them some things like star rating questions so that I can track metrics over time, but then also some open-ended questions about what worked really well, what didn't work well, and any ideas they have on what could make their first week easier if they could go over it again. It's played a huge part in how we've shaped the process, and every single time I send out this feedback survey, we get really great responses that make it even easier for the next person joining the team. We also make it easy for people to contribute their feedback directly into the process. The FAQs and the team documentation is editable by anyone, and they're encouraged to correct anything that's not valid and make pull requests to make sure that we're keeping all of the information up to date. These little contributions are also good because they help them feel more a part of the team already because they're already contributing back. So that's a lot of stuff. It might be kind of hard to visualize it as an actual process. So I'm going to show you how we've put this together at Fellow. This is an example template of a note that we use for people joining the team. So it gets attached to the all-day event marking their first day on the calendar, and it's divided up into sections that cover each of the steps of the process. The resources section includes links to documentation and handbooks that have most of the answers people need, and the three sections at the bottom contain a bunch of action items with setup process for the first day, accounts to sign up for, and a bunch of goals for them to achieve over the next week. So this works for the first day, first week for the start of the onboarding process. But then outside of this, we also set up a bunch of different meetings. Like we have sales demos that engineers get to sit on. We have team lunches, now team Zoom calls, and a lot of different things like that. GitLab also has a very similar set of templates that guide people through their first few days and sets them up with accounts and lets them know what's to come and what's expected of them. So very similar. This is a screenshot of just part of one. GitLab's entire company handbook is available online for free, including the remote onboarding templates. So if you search for GitLab remote onboarding online, it'll come up. And I highly recommend this as a resource to base the start of your process off of. With these 6 steps as a baseline, so relationships, knowledge, FAQs, goals, space, and feedback, you'll have a great foundation to create a repeatable onboarding process for your team. These are really the bare bones that you need in order to level the playing field and make sure that everyone joining gets an equal footing in their first few weeks. And you never want to leave this all to chance and just hope that the person ends up befriending someone who walks them through everything or is extroverted enough to figure things out for themselves. And while some of those stuffs might seem like things to tackle later on when you have your next hire, there's some things that you can start doing today to get ready for them. So no matter what your role is on the team, you can start by creating a set of documentation for your code base with things like obscure knowledge that you just happen to know, like how to set up a testing environment of the billing system or who has the right auth tokens to re-record API test cassettes. And this doesn't have to be a line-by-line walkthrough of the code base. You can also create a team FAQ for non-code things, like which meetings are actually meetings and what you don't have to go to. And lastly, you can ask your team for feedback. Even if you didn't have any kind of official process, everyone on your team started at some point, and they probably have some thoughts on what could have made it easier. So ask them or send out a survey and use that as a base point to figure out what changes you can start making right away to your onboarding process. This process will take some time to build up from scratch, and you probably want to start basic before ramping up to anything too complicated. Eventually, you can start experimenting with things like classes or official meet and greet sessions and things like that. But remember that there is such a thing as too much process. So if you have a company with 10 people, you probably don't need to have a week-long process with classes and instructors and a bunch of structure like that. But you should still start small and build up as needed because you want to give people some flexibility in how they start their new job. I hope that I've given you some ideas on how you can create your own first onboarding program or change up what you have now to make it more remote friendly. I'd love to hear about any unique ways you're onboarding people or if you've had any success with what I've talked about today. You can get in touch with me through my Twitter handle at alexandras_dev. Thank you.